Hey, if you're watching this right now, if you found this channel at some ungodly hour with a cup of tea going cold beside you, or you're folding laundry trying to forget about someone who doesn't deserve your brain space, I want you to know this channel was built for you. Specifically for you, the woman who held it together when she had every right to fall apart. The woman who kept showing up, kept building, kept smiling at people who were quietly taking pieces of her. The woman who never got the apology she deserved, so she did something better. She made it irrelevant. This is her untold revenge. And tonight's story? Oh, tonight's story is one I have been sitting with for a long time. Get comfortable. This one's going to take a while, and it is so worth it. My name is Marlowe Ashby, and I used to believe that the right kind of love could make you invisible in the best possible way, like you could dissolve into someone else's life and call that belonging. I was 31 years old, standing in my own commercial kitchen at 2 in the morning, piping rosemary cream onto 72 individual beef Wellingtons, when I finally understood that the life I had been building wasn't mine at all. It had been a stage set, and someone else had been living the real story behind it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, because you need the whole picture to understand what it meant when I walked through those venue doors 3 weeks later, not as a bride, not as a guest, but as the caterer. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and if you know anything about Savannah, you know that food isn't just food there. It is history. It is hierarchy. It is a love language and a weapon all at once. My grandmother, Greta Ashby, we called her Mema Greta, she was the woman who set the table at every family gathering, from Easter to the 4th of July, to random Tuesday dinners that somehow turned into 20-person affairs. She made shrimp and grits from memory. Age 78. She could time 4 different dishes to finish simultaneously without a single timer, just by instinct, just by smell and sound and some internal clock that I honestly believe was passed down through her hands into mine. The tradition in our family, and I want you to understand, this wasn't a soft suggestion, this was law, was that the women cooked for the men. Every celebration, every milestone, every moment of pride belonged to the men, and the women expressed their love and their value through the food they placed in front of them. Mema Greta never questioned it. My mother, Diana, never questioned it. When I was 12 and told my mother I wanted to go to culinary school someday, she smiled at me the way you smile at a child who says they want to be an astronaut. Sweet, impossible, something to grow out of. You cook for your family, Marlowe, she said, stirring her tea without looking at me. You don't cook for strangers. That's not what our women do. I want you to sit with that for a second. That's not what our women do. As if I had been born into a species with a predetermined function. As if the thing I loved most about myself, this ability to walk into a kitchen and make something out of nothing, to feed people in a way that made them close their eyes, was only legitimate if it stayed domestic, if it stayed invisible, if it served the right people. I filed that away, the way I filed away a lot of things in that house. I met Declan Forsyth my junior year at the Savannah College of Art and Design, where I was studying culinary arts while quietly terrifying my mother by existing outside the family script. Declan was studying architecture. He was tall and narrow-shouldered and had this nervous laugh that I thought was endearing, for approximately 3 years before I realized it appeared specifically when he was lying. He was from Charleston originally, old money adjacent, the kind of family that had a portrait in the hallway and never talked about money because they didn't have to. He was charming in that effortless Southern way, where you don't realize until much later that the charm was a layer, not a foundation. We dated for 5 years before he proposed. And I want to be fair here, those 5 years weren't all bad. There were genuinely beautiful moments. Road trips down the Georgia coast, late nights cooking together in my tiny apartment, his voice reading to me from architecture books while I fell asleep. I loved him. I want to be clear about that because I think sometimes when we tell these stories we flatten the person into a villain from the start, and that's not honest. I loved Declan Forsyth. I loved him with the kind of earnestness that I now understand made me vulnerable in ways I didn't know to protect. My best friend since the age of 9 was a woman named Serena Voss. Serena and I had grown up 4 houses apart on the same street in Savannah's Ardsley Park neighborhood. We had survived middle school, together, survived our first heartbreaks together, survived my father's death together. I was 19 when my dad died of a sudden cardiac event, and Serena was the person who slept on my floor for 2 weeks because she knew I couldn't be alone at night. That's the kind of friendship I thought we had, the floor sleeping kind. The kind you don't interrogate because it has proven itself over and over and over. Serena was beautiful in a way that rooms noticed. She had her mother's Haitian bone structure and her father's Georgia drawl and this ease in her own skin that I had always quietly admired and never once felt threatened by. Because she was mine. She was my person. I had never, not even for a flickering second, considered her a competitor because the word would have felt like a betrayal of everything we were to each other. I introduced her to Declan in year 2. I want you to understand that. I brought Serena into my relationship because that was what you did. You shared your life. IF with your best friend. You wanted the people you loved to know each other. And for 3 years, they did, as far as I knew. Declan proposed on a Sunday morning in October. We were at Forsyth Park, very on the nose, very Savannah, and he got down on one knee next to the big fountain, and the ring was a family piece, a cushion-cut diamond in a yellow gold setting that had belonged to his grandmother, and I said yes before he finished the sentence. My mother cried. Mema Greta, who was still alive then and sharp as a tack at 83, looked at the ring with this particular expression I didn't know how to read at the time. Not disapproval, exactly. Something quieter, like recognition. He's a handsome man, she said, which from Mema Greta meant, I am choosing not to say what I'm actually thinking. I was 30. The wedding was set for the following September. 11 months of planning, which for a woman who owned her own catering and event company felt both manageable and thrill. Because I was going to cater my own engagement party and design every single element of the reception menu myself. That was the plan. That was going to be the moment when the professional and personal finally merged, when the life I had built would get to show itself off. Let me tell you about Ashby and Table, because she matters to this story almost as much as the people do. I had started my company at 26, 2 years out of culinary school, with $11,000 in savings, a secondhand convection oven, and a stubbornness that I have since learned to call determination. My mother thought I was having a breakdown. Declan thought it was charming, a hobby that might become something. Serena was the only person who drove with me to look at commercial kitchen spaces, who helped me write my business plan, who sat across from me at my kitchen table and said, Marlowe, this is actually going to work. I built Ashby and Table from the ground up. I mean that in the least metaphor. Rickle way possible, I painted the walls of my first commercial kitchen space myself, on my hands and knees, because I couldn't afford to hire anyone. I did weddings for $200 over cost in the beginning just to build a portfolio. I drove myself to farmers markets at 5 in the morning to meet the producers personally because I wanted the food to mean something. I sent handwritten thank you notes to every single client for the first 3 years. I worked 80-hour weeks without flinching, and when Declan complained that I was never home for dinner, I started prepping his meals on Sunday nights so he'd have everything ready without needing me there to make it. I was always managing both lives. The one where I was building something, and the one where I was making sure the building wasn't too inconvenient for the people around me. By the time I got engaged, Ashby and Table had a full-time staff of 8, a waiting list for weekend bookings, and had been featured in Garden and Gun magazine's roundup of the South's most distinctive wedding caterers. I had done this. I had built this thing out of $11,000 in sheer refusal, and it was mine, and it was real, and it was the truest expression of who I was as a person. And I want you to ask yourself, have you ever built something from nothing and had the people who were supposed to be proud of you look at it like it was still just a hobby? Because if you have, drop a comment below, because I want to know I'm not the only one who smiled and said, thank you, when what I meant was, look at what I did without your help. Now let me tell you about my niece, Blythe. Blythe was my brother Garrett's daughter, and she was 8 years old when I got engaged. She was this tiny, serious child with my grandmother's eyes and an interest in cooking that lit her up from the inside out. When she came to visit, she didn't want to watch cartoons. She wanted to stand on her step stool next to me at the kitchen company, under and learn how to fold pastry dough and why you rested meat before cutting it and what the difference was between sautéing and sweating an onion. Why does it matter? She asked me once, about the onion, with this absolute gravity that made me want to cry because she was 8 and she was asking why technique mattered, and nobody in our family had ever asked me that before. Because the difference is the flavor, I told her. One you're cooking for speed, and one you're cooking for depth. You always want to know which one you're doing. She repeated that back to me a week later, like she'd been memorizing it. The first time Blythe appears in this story in a real way was about 2 months after the engagement, when the whole family gathered at my mother's house for a Sunday dinner. I was in the kitchen with my mother and two aunts, preparing the meal while the men sat in the living room watching football. And Blythe came padding and wearing her good dress, climbed up next to me, and Aid, very matter-of-factly. "Can I help?" My mother said, gently but clearly. "Honey, why don't you go sit with your daddy? The kitchen's getting crowded." And Blythe looked at me, not at my mother, at me, and I saw in that little face something I recognized. She was asking me to save her a spot. She was asking me whether this was a place she was allowed to be. I handed her a wooden spoon and said, "Stir the butter when I tell you." My mother's mouth pressed thin. She didn't say anything. But I felt the weight of the tradition in the room like a physical thing, like a hand on the back of my neck, and I thought, I am not teaching this child that she cooks in secret. The wedding was planned for September 14th. By mid-July, I had finalized the menu, a low country-inspired spread that I had spent 3 months developing, with a signature cocktail I had named Forsyth Fountain, after the park where Declan proposed. The venue was a restored antebellum estate outside of Savannah. I had actually catered events at twice before, which felt pleasingly full circle. Serena was my maid of honor. I want to let that sit there for a second. My maid of honor, the woman helping me choose my dress, tasting cake samples beside me, texting me photos of centerpiece options at midnight. The woman I had known for 22 years. The woman who had slept on my floor. On August 20th, 3 weeks and 2 days before the wedding, Declan called me from his architecture firm at 4:30 in the afternoon. He asked if I was sitting down. I wasn't. I was standing in my commercial kitchen plating samples for a tasting, and something in his voice made my hands stop moving before my brain caught up to why. He told me he was in love with Serena. He told me it had been going on for 7 months. He told me he was sorry, and he told me he couldn't go through with the wedding. And then he said, and I want you to really hear this part, he said, "I think you knew things weren't right between us." I did not know. I want to be extremely clear about that. I did not know. I had been planning our wedding. I had been building our future. I had been cooking his Sunday meals and staying late at the office and assuming that the distance I occasionally felt between us was the normal friction of two busy people building two big lives. I stood there holding a piping bag, and I did not say a single word. I don't know how long the silence lasted. Declan eventually said my name, uncertain, like he was checking whether I was still there. "I heard you," I said, and I hung up. I finished piping all 72 samples. I tasted them. I adjusted the seasoning on the sauce. I wrote detailed notes for my sous chef, a woman named Priya, who had been with me 4 years and who knew my moods well enough to understand that the quieter I was, the worse it was. She didn't ask. She just stayed. I drove home at 8 o'clock. I sat in my car in the driveway for 45 minutes. I went inside and I called my mother because even at 31, heartbreak makes you want your mother. She cried. Then she said, "What did you do wrong?" And honestly, that question saved me. Not in the way she intended it, but in the way that a slap of cold water saves you when you're about to go under. It shocks you out of the spiral and into something harder and colder and more useful. I thanked her for calling. I hung up. And I sat with the clarity of knowing that I was completely structurally alone. I won't spend too long in the grief of those 3 weeks, because that's not the story. But I want you to know it was real. I want you to know that I woke up at 3 in the morning with my hands shaking, reaching for a phone to text Serena and then remembering. I want you to know that I drove past the venue once by accident, taking a route I'd taken 100 times and had to pull over because I couldn't see. I want you to know that the deposits I'd already paid out the flow. The string quartet, the calligrapher totaled just over $19,000, and I ate every penny of it alone because I couldn't face the administrative process of unwinding it. I want you to know that I considered not being okay. And I want you to know I chose not to let that in, not because I was strong in some cinematic way, but because Ashby and Table had 3 major events booked in the next 6 weeks, and 11 people depended on my ability to function. So, I functioned. Serena called me once, about 4 days after Declan's call. She started with, "I need you to know this wasn't planned," and I said, "Please don't." And she kept going, and I hung up. She texted twice more. I read them both. I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing her, though I won't pretend there wasn't something in me that wanted to, but because I genuinely could not find a version of that conversation that would leave me standing afterward. I told exactly 3 people the full truth. Priya, my business attorney Cass Whitmore, and my brother Garrett. Everyone else got a version. Now here is where I need to tell you something. Because about 2 weeks after the breakup, 2 weeks into my own private demolition, when I was barely sleeping and living on black coffee and the sensory comfort of working with my hands, I got an inquiry through my business website. The name on the inquiry form was Declan Forsyth. He and Serena wanted to get married. They wanted to do it quickly, just a small ceremony, less than 100 guests, at the same estate I had already scouted for my own wedding. The date they proposed was November 15th, less than 3 months away. And they were inquiring about Ashby and table for catering. I stared at this inquiry for a long time. I want you to think about this. I want you to actually sit with what this inquiry represents. Either they had no idea that this was my company, which would mean neither of them had paid enough attention to what I'd build. To know the name of it, or they did know and were asking anyway, which is its own kind of audacity. It was the first option. They genuinely didn't know. I had mentioned Ashby and table to Declan hundreds of times, and he had mentally filed it somewhere between hobby and thing Marlowe does. He had attended exactly one Ashby and table event in 5 years, my second anniversary party, for the company, and had spent most of it talking to a man he'd met at the bar about golf. When I understood this, something settled in my chest. Not anger. Something colder and more deliberate. Something that felt, if I'm honest, like opportunity. Have you ever been handed exactly what you needed in exactly the worst possible packaging? Like the universe set something in front of you and said, "Here's your test. What do you do with this?" Drop a comment if you know that feeling. Because in that moment, I was very still, and I was very clear. I accepted the inquiry. Now let me tell you about the second time. Me Blythe appears in this story. It was a family dinner in early October. I had started going to family dinners again, partly because isolating was making things worse, and partly because Mema Greta was declining slowly, and I wanted to be present for that. Blythe was there, 9 years old now, and she had gotten it into her head that she wanted to be a chef. She announced this at the dinner table, bright-faced, utterly serious, fork down, looking around at the adults the way children do when they're about to say something they've prepared. "I want to go to cooking school," she said. Like Aunt Marlowe. My mother looked at Garrett. Garrett's wife, Tamsin, made a face I had seen my own mother make, that careful, discouraging non-expression. And then my mother said, warmly but firmly, the way you say things when you want them to sound like love instead of limits. "Well, sweetheart, that's a fun idea. But cooking school is a lot of work for not very much reward. Maybe something more stab. Doesn't that sound better?" Blythe looked at me across the table, and I looked at my mother, and at Tamsin, and at the whole architecture of the room, the men at one end of the table, the women at the other, the meal I had helped prepare, the tradition sitting over all of us like weather, and I thought about what it cost me, and what it was costing her, and how many women in this family had folded the thing they wanted into something smaller and called it wisdom. "Culinary school," I said, clearly and calmly. "It's called culinary school. And Ashby and table was built from culinary school. And Blythe, if you want to go, I will take you to visit my alma mater when you're ready." The table was quiet. My mother smiled tightly. Garrett cleared his throat. Blythe looked at me like I had just told her something she intended to memorize. I met with Serena and Declan for the venue walkthrough on October 18th. My assistant, a composed young woman named Justine who knew the full story, and had offered to quit in solidarity, and whom I had talked out of quitting with both gratitude and practical reasoning, drove the van, while I sat in the passenger seat going over the event file. I had built them a spectacular proposal. That is not an exaggeration. I had built them a menu that was better than anything I had considered for my own wedding: a 4-course seated dinner with a past appetizer reception, a custom cocktail program, and a dessert display that I had been designing in my head since the inquiry came in. Every single detail was calibrated. Not out of generosity, out of something I didn't have a clean word for at the time, but which I now understand was pride. The pride of a woman who refuses to let you see her broken, refuses to let the work become small because the circumstances are terrible. I dressed carefully for that meeting. Navy linen blazer, cream blouse, dark trousers, my grandmother's gold chain at my throat. Professional, unreadable. Serena arrived. First. She came through the venue's main entrance and stopped when she saw me, and her face did about 4 things in 2 seconds: recognition, guilt, something that might have been relief, and then the determined composure of a woman who had been rehearsing this interaction. "Marlowe," she said. "Serena," I said. "Thanks for choosing Ashby and table. Shall we wait for Declan or get started?" She opened her mouth. I had already turned toward the main hall. Declan arrived 6 minutes later. He was thinner than I remembered, which I noticed the way you notice weather as information, not feeling. He looked at me with the expression of a man who had been hoping, against all evidence, that the appointment might have been handled by someone else. It had not been. "I'll walk you through the space and then we can sit down and review the proposal," I said. Business voice. Event voice. The voice I used with clients I liked and clients I didn't, because it was the same voice and that was the point. I showed them the room. I showed them the lighting rigs I'd spec'd, the linen options, the layout for the cocktail hour flow. I answered every question with precision. I did not break eye contact when I didn't have to, and I did not avoid it when Serena was speaking. I was present. I was the professional in the room. I was, in some fundamental way, the most powerful person there because I held every detail of this event in my hands, and they needed me. Serena touched my arm once just briefly, reaching for something about the floral placement, and I stepped smoothly to one side to indicate the layout board, which required no touching, and continued talking. Natural, fluid, completely intentional. At the end of the walkthrough, we sat at the planning table, and I slid the proposal across to them. Declan looked at the number. His eyebrows moved. "This is competitive," he said, meaning, "This is good. We work hard to deliver value," I said, and meant every word. I accepted the contract. I built the event. I want to tell you now about November 15th, because this is where the story lives. This is the room I have been walking you toward. I arrived at the estate at 6:45 in the morning with my full team, Priya, Justine, 3 line cooks, 2 front-of-house leads, and a prep team of 4. We came in the service entrance, as caterers always do, through the back of the house, through the kitchen that I had personally inspected twice during the planning process and found impeccably functional. We set up in organized silence, because my teams are trained and because Priya had spent the week prior running the timeline until it was automatic. I had not slept the night before. I want to be honest about that. I had lain in bed from 11 until about 3, and then I'd given up and gone to my kitchen and made bread, actual, yeasted bread, just to have something to do with my hands. There was no crisis, no doubt, no second guessing. I was simply awake in the specific way you are awake before something that matters. The estate was beautiful in November morning light. Frost on the lawn, low copper sun coming through the live oaks, Spanish moss catching the light and holding it. Savannah in November is a particular kind of gorgeous. The air is cool and still, and everything looks like it was painted by someone who understood that beauty is most striking when it's slightly melancholy. I thought about my grandmother that morning, standing at the back kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I thought about the hundreds of times she had cooked for a room she wasn't invited to sit in. I thought about my mother's face when I told her I was going to culinary school. I thought about a 12-year-old girl being told that her passion was only legitimate if it stayed invisible. And then I put down my coffee cup and I went to work. By 10 o'clock, the kitchen was fully operational. Priya had the first course staged and ready. The line was clean and organized. Mise en place complete, timing synchronized. The front-of-house team had completed setup of the dining room and cocktail space. I had been in there at 9 to do a final walk, adjusting 2 centerpieces and 1 table placement that was 2 inches off the diagram. Not because anyone would notice, because I notice. Guests began arriving around 3. I was in the kitchen. I did not go into the main rooms during the reception. That was not the plan. And deviating from the plan would have been a choice about something other than the event. Serena had requested that I personally present the first course. This was in the contract. She had specifically requested a Meet the Chef moment, which is a service tier Ashby, and table offers, and which had been included in the proposal without comment. She had written it in herself, in an email that said, simply, "Can Marlowe present the first course? I think the guests would love to hear about the menu." I had read that email and held it for a long time. It was possible she was trying to honor me in the only way she had left to her. It was possible she wanted to show me off, show the room, that her wedding had been catered by a woman she'd once loved like a sister. It was possible she just thought it would make for a good moment. I didn't know, and I decided I didn't need to. I was going to present the first course. That was settled. At 6:15, the guests moved into the dining room for the seated portion of the evening. My front-of-house lead, a meticulous man named Gerald, ran the floor with quiet precision. I changed into my chef's whites in the kitchen. They were starched, they were perfect, and they had my name embroidered on the breast pocket in small navy script. Marlowe Ashby, Ashby and Table. I had a specific pair I wore for presentations. They were my best. At 6:28, I walked out of the kitchen and into the dining room. I need you to understand what this room looked like because the physical space matters. The estate's main dining room had been designed for exactly this kind of moment: high ceilings with plasterwork details, long windows draped in sage velvet, a herringbone parquet floor that was original to the house, and therefore had the kind of patina that money cannot manufacture. There were 14 tables, each seating 8, covered in ivory linen, and dressed in low arrangements of white garden roses, and dried grasses, and tapered candles that gave everything a warm, flickering glow. The room smelled of beeswax and the faint gardenia of the center flowers, and, beneath all of it, the beginning of the food, the warm, savory undertow of the first course waiting in the kitchen. 91 guests. They were seated, glasses of champagne and the signature cocktail distributed, in the comfortable, slightly elevated mood of a wedding dinner that has so far gone. Exactly as hoped, there was conversation, laughter, the particular contentment of people who have eaten excellent appetizers and are now anticipating more. I walked in from the side entrance near the head table, and I did not walk quickly. I want you to understand the pace I held. It was the pace of a woman who owns every inch of the floor she is standing on. It was unhurried. It was certain. The head table was arranged so that Declan and Serena sat at the center, flanked by their respective families. Declan's mother, whom I had met 12 times and who had been perfectly kind to me for 5 years, was there. Serena's mother, Odette, whom I had called Aunt Odette since I was 9 years old, was there. And my family, my mother, my brother Garrett, Tamsin and Blythe were at table 4, which I had placed there because I had controlled the seating chart as part of full event management. Blythe was there, 10 years old, in a silver dress with her hair done up properly, sitting between her parents at table 4, and when she saw me come through that side door, she went absolutely still. Her eyes went wide, and then very slowly she started to smile. I stopped at the head table first. The room took about 4 seconds to notice me, that spreading awareness you get in a dining room when something has shifted, when attention begins to orient itself toward a point. Conversations quieted, not all at once but gradually, the way a tide pulls back before something. Heads turned, and then the room was, not silent, but listening. Serena saw me from perhaps 10 feet away, and I watched her face. She was beautiful, she is. She always has been, and she was happy, I think, in the way that people are happy on their wedding days, even when the foundations are complicated. She was wearing ivory silk, her hair pinned up simply. She looked, if I'm being fair, radiant. And then she saw me walking toward the head table, and radiance is a complicated thing to hold when you are. I also feel something else. Declan saw me half a second later. He had his champagne glass raised from some toast or conversation, and I watched his hand lower, just slightly, as his brain processed what his eyes were telling him. I stepped up to the head table and I stood between their chairs, not in front of Serena, not in front of Declan, but squarely between them, the way you stand when you are speaking to a room and you want the whole room to hear. "Good evening," I said. The room had gone genuinely quiet now. Not the silence of something wrong, but the silence of attention. "My name is Marlowe Ashby. I am the founder and executive chef of Ashby & Table, and it is our distinct pleasure to be serving you tonight." I said this clearly. I said this without a single tremor. I had practiced it at 2 a.m. in my kitchen, and I had not needed to practice it, as it turned out, because the version that came out was better than the rehearsed one. It was just the truth, said Pla. Inley. Tonight's menu is a 4-course celebration of Low Country culinary tradition reimagined, refined, and built from relationships I have spent nearly a decade cultivating with farmers, fishermen, and makers throughout coastal Georgia and South Carolina. I paused. Every dish you'll eat tonight has a story. I want to briefly share a few of them. I talked about the first course. I talked about the sourcing of the blue crab and the technique behind the bisque and why I had chosen a particular blending method that resulted in the specific texture I was chasing. I talked about it the way I always talk about food, not performing expertise, but sharing actual love, the genuine thing, the reason I had built this company and this life. The room was very still. I did not look at Declan for most of this. I looked at the room. I looked at individual faces. I always do this when I present, because food is for people, and I want people to feel addressed personally. I looked at Declan's mother, her who had a particular expression on her face that I read as something between grief and admiration, and I held her gaze for just a moment and then moved on. I looked at Odette, Serena's mother, who was not looking at me but was looking at the centerpiece arrangement with the focused attention of a woman thinking very hard about something that isn't the centerpiece. I looked at the guests I didn't know, who were leaning in slightly, who had been expecting a standard chef introduction and were instead receiving something that felt more like witnessing. And then I looked at table 4. My mother was sitting with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her face was doing something I had almost never seen it do, and it took me a moment to identify it. She was proud. Just that. Just simply proud, in a way that she hadn't managed when I'd been featured in the magazine, in a way she hadn't managed at the company launch party, in a way that required, apparently, seeing me stand the front of a full room with 91 people listening to me with their full attention and their champagne glasses going warm, because they didn't want to move. And Blythe was sitting forward in her chair with both hands pressing on the table like she was trying not to levitate. Her eyes were on me with an intensity that 10-year-olds are not supposed to have. Or maybe they are supposed to have it, and we spend years diluting it out of them. She looked at me the way I had looked at my grandmother in the kitchen. Like she was memorizing everything. Like she was deciding something. I completed the introduction. I thanked the couple I said Serena and Declan, with the same professional warm neutrality I would use for any couple, and I told the room that my team was honored to be part of their celebration and that the first course would be served momentarily. Light applause. More than light, actually genuine applause that grew the way applause does when a room has been moved. Rather than just entertained, I turned to leave. Serena reached out and touched my wrist. Just briefly, not grabbing, just a touch. I stopped. She looked up at me, and I looked down at her, and there were about 1,000 things in that look from her side guilt, yes, but also something that I think was genuine feeling, the remnant of 22 years that doesn't just switch off because you've done a terrible thing. She opened her mouth. Marlowe, she said, quietly, just my name. I covered her hand with mine, just for a second, just the span of a breath, and then I stepped back, and I smiled at her, and it was a real smile, not a performance. And then I went back into the kitchen. Priya was waiting just inside the kitchen door. She had a look on her face that she was working very hard to keep neutral, and not quite succeeding, and when I came through she pressed her lips together and nodded at me once, slowly, and that was the most she needed to say. Let's get the first course. Out, I said, 4 top timing starting with the head table. And we did. We executed that dinner with the same precision and care and genuine love that we brought to every event, and it was, by any objective measure, flawless. The bisque went out perfectly tempered. The entree, a pan-seared red snapper with hoppin' john and a sweet corn nage, drew actual sounds from the room, the kind of sounds that mean you have gotten someone somewhere past their own expectations. The dessert display was the most beautiful thing I had produced all year. Possibly ever. A tiered arrangement of praline cake, bourbon banana tarts, and individual Ben wafer towers that I had been building in my head for 3 months. After service, when the guests had moved to the dancing portion of the evening, and my team was breaking down the kitchen with their characteristic organized speed, Declan came to find me. I was at the prep station, reviewing the breakdown checklist with Justine, when I heard the kitchen door. I didn't look up immediately. I finished the point I was making to Justine, handed her the checklist, and then turned around. He looked like a man who had prepared a speech and was no longer certain it was the right speech. He was still in his suit, slightly loosened at the collar, and he had the look of someone who has eaten a very good meal and is feeling, in consequence, somewhat vulnerable. The food was extraordinary, he said. I mean that. Thank you, I said. We worked hard on the menu. Marlowe Declan, I said, not unkindly. I hope you have a wonderful evening. I hope you're very happy. And I meant it, not as a performance of magnanimity. I genuinely meant it, because I had done the work, and the work had mattered, and my opinion of the food was not contingent on the happiness of the people eating it, and also because carrying hatred into a kitchen is a contamination I have never been willing to risk. He stood there for a moment. Then he nodded. Then he went back to his wedding. Here is what happened between October and November that I haven't told you yet. On October 3rd, I met with Cass Whitmore, my business attorney, and I made 2 structural moves. The first was a trademark filing on the Ashby and table name and logo, which I should have done years earlier, and which Cass had been gently suggesting for approximately as long as she'd been my attorney. It was a formality, In a sense, the name and brand were already mine by use, but formalizing it meant that my company, the thing I had built from nothing, could not be disputed or diluted or quietly absorbed by anyone who might one day try to put their name adjacent to it. It was a document. It was real. It couldn't be undone. The second was a partnership agreement with the estate venue that I signed on October 15th, 3 days before the Serena and Declan walkthrough. The estate had been looking to formalize a preferred caterer relationship for years, and I had been in casual conversa. Ties with the owner for 18 months. I finalized it. Exclusive preferred catering partner for all estate events for a minimum of 5 years, with right of first refusal on all premium bookings. This meant that any future event at that estate, any anniversary dinner, any renewal of vows, any celebration that Serena and Declan might choose to host there would default through me. Through Ashby and Table, not because of a personal grudge, but because I had been building toward that partnership for a year and a half, and the timing had finally aligned. The estate owner, a woman named Philippa Marsh, who had met me twice for coffee and understood exactly the quality of work I brought to her property, signed without hesitation. Cass looked at me across her desk when we filed the final copy and said, "You're thinking about this very clearly." "I'm a caterer," I said. "I always think about timing. Now I need to tell you about the third time Blythe appears. Because this is where I have to. Slow all the way down, because this is the moment that made everything else possible. It was 2 days after the wedding. I was at my mother's house. She had called and asked me to come for dinner. Just us, which was unusual enough that I went. I arrived to find that my mother had made a pot roast, which is her version of saying, "I'm sorry" without saying "I'm sorry," and we ate it in the kitchen together. Just the two of us, which we had not done since before my father died. She didn't bring up the wedding. She asked about Ashby and Table's upcoming bookings. She asked about Priya, whom she'd always liked. We talked for an hour about ordinary things, and it was, in its way, one of the most intimate conversations we'd had in years, because what we were really saying, in the language of pot roast and careful questions, was, "I see you. I'm here. I got it wrong for a long time. I was driving home when my phone rang. It was Tamsin, Garrett's wife. She called me on the phone directly, which she did perhaps once a year, and her voice when I answered had the specific flatness of a woman choosing her words with extreme care. "Marlowe," she said, "I need to tell you something about Blythe." What she told me was this: that at school that week, Blythe had been asked by her teacher to write a paragraph about what she wanted to be when she grew up. And Blythe had written, "I want to be a chef like my Aunt Marlowe. She has her own company, and she feeds people at big parties, and everyone pays attention when she talks. My grandma says cooking is just for home, but I watched my aunt, and I don't think that's true." The teacher had marked it with a smiley face and a note that said "wonderful." And then Tamsin had seen it, and apparently had a conversation with Blythe about whether this was a realistic goal. And Blythe, 10 years old, immovable as stone, had said, "Aunt Marlowe did it, so I can do it." Tamsin was calling me. I understood, not to critique this, but because she didn't know what do with a child who had decided to be immovable, and I was the source of the immovability. I sat in my car in my driveway, the same driveway where I had sat the night Declan called me, and I listened to Tamsin finish, and then I said, "Thank you for telling me. I'll call Blythe tomorrow." I did call Blythe the next morning. She answered with the careful politeness of a child who doesn't yet know if they're in trouble. "I heard about your paragraph," I said. A pause. "Are you mad? Are you kidding me? I'm the proudest person alive." She made a sound that was something between a laugh and a cry, and then she said, in a rush, "Grandma said you wasted a lot of time and money on your cooking school and that I should do something stable." And I said, "But Aunt Marlowe has a whole company." And she said that Aunt Marlowe is special, but most people aren't. And I said, "But how do you know if you're special, if you never try?" I had to stop her there. Not because she was wrong, because she was exactly right, and I was going to cry in a way that was not going to be useful to either of us. "Blythe," I said, "listen to me, you are going to try, and I'm going to make sure of it. Okay?" "Okay," she said, very small, very certain. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. And what I felt, I want to name this precisely, was not anger. What I felt was the absolute bone-deep clarity of purpose. Because here was this child who had been watching me, who had decided that what I had built was proof that something was possible, and the women in our family were going to try to talk her out of it, the same way they had tried to talk me out of it, and I was the only person positioned to stop that from happening. Not by arguing, not by confronting anyone, by building something she could point to. Something undeniable. Something with her name adjacent to it, someday, if she wanted it. I went back to Cass the following week. I finalized the paperwork to bring Ashby and Table into an LLC structure that would protect its assets and allow for future partnership arrangements. And I also began the formal planning process for what would become, 3 years later, the Ashby and Table Culinary Apprenticeship Program for young women in the Savannah area, a structured, funded pathway to culinary careers for girls aged 16 to 22 who otherwise might hear, "That's not what our women do," and believe it. Blythe was 10. She had years before she'd be eligible. But I built it with her in mind, and she knew it, and that has always been enough. The November 15th event was reviewed by 3 guests on Ashby and Table's website in the week that followed. All 3 were 5-star reviews. 2 specifically mentioned the chef presentation. One wrote, "I don't know who Marlowe Ashby is, but whoever she is remarkable." I read that review at my kitchen table, early on a Tuesday morning, with a cup of coffee that did not go cold, and I felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not triumph, exactly, something quieter. The feeling of a thing completed. There is a set of copper saucepans in my commercial kitchen that belonged to Mema Greta. She gave them to me the year before she died, handed them over in a box with brown paper wrapping like a gift, though it wasn't any occasion, just a Tuesday afternoon when I came to visit. She was 84 and her hands shook, but her eyes were sharp, and she looked at me when she gave them over and said, "You're going to do something with these that I never got to." She died 6 months before I launched Ashby and Table. She never saw the kitchen. She never saw my name in the magazine, never saw the estate partnership, never sat in one of those dining rooms and watched 91 people go quiet when I walked out. But those pans are in my kitchen every single day. They are heavy, and they are beautiful, and they are the oldest thing in the room. Every time I put one on the heat, I feel this. Lineage, the grandmother who cooked in invisibility, and the great-grandmother before her, and whoever came before that, women who put food in front of other people and called it love and were never asked what they wanted in return. I cook in those pans and I feed people and I put my name on the work and I charge what I'm worth. I own the thing I built. I sign the contracts. I walk into rooms and I am seen. And somewhere in Savannah, a 10-year-old girl who is now 13 is keeping a paragraph in the front of her school notebook. Her mother told me this, the paragraph that says, "My aunt has her own company, and everyone pays attention when she talks." I don't think my grandma is right. She is not right. She was never right. And now there is proof. I want to talk to you directly for just a second before we close. If you are the woman who folded herself small so the people around her could stay comfortable, I see you. If you are the woman who built something extraordinary in the margins of a life that was supposed to look different, I see you. If you are the woman who smiled at a table set by tradition and felt the cost of it all the way down in your chest, I see you. You don't have to be loud about it. The loudest revenge is almost never the most effective one. The most effective one is quiet and structural and undeniable. It's your name on the door. It's the partnership agreement. It's the 5-year contract. It's walking into the room where you were supposed to be broken and being, instead, the person everyone came to watch. It's the copper pans on the heat. It's the girl with the paragraph in her notebook. It's the thing you built that no one can take back. That is the story of Marlowe Ashby. And if this story found something in you, if you felt it somewhere in your body, not just in your head, I want you to share this video with exactly one woman who needs it. You know who she is. You probably thought of her before I finished that sentence. Send it to her. Let her know she's not alone in having been here. Subscribe to her untold revenge. Because there are more women with more stories, and every single one of them deserves to be heard. And the next time someone tells you that what you love isn't for women like you, remember Marlowe. Remember the copper pans. Remember the room going quiet. And keep cooking.